Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 18th of November 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio is Mike Robinson, and we're going to be joined today by a live Skype link with Alex Thompson, who will be reporting from the Netherlands with his updates on what's happening not only in Holland but other European countries, particularly in wake of the Paris attacks. Well, before we get going on all of that, a brief word on the weather. I was simply going to say that it was pretty rainy, cloudy and gloomy, but what's popped up is apparently a little bit of sunshine popping through in southeast London. So if you're in the London end of the country, or at the London end of the country at the moment, I suggest you bask in that for as long as possible before the rain resumes. Well, credit where it's due, and Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire has posted Orwell's Razor. All of 21st Century Wire's predictions have come true days after the Paris attacks. And what Patrick Henningsen is talking about is his predictions that he made during a extended interview with Russia Today. And we've got to say, Patrick, we agree, you were spot on. Couple of things haven't quite materialised at the moment, but the bulk of the things that you were talking about have materialised. So we thought, how do we present this as simply as possible? We thought a UK column wiring diagram was the way to go. So let's have a look at some of the things that Patrick said were going to be happening as a result of the Paris attacks. And we've labelled this just what have the Paris attacks really unleashed, because we're now starting to look into the results of those attacks and how the attacks ultimately are going to affect our lives. So this is the first thing. He said that he predicted there was going to be a declaration of a state of emergency in France. He predicted the closure of EU's free borders. He said they will up the airstrikes in Syria, and there'll be calls for a no-fly zone, because of course not only do you need no-fly zones in order to ensure air safety over the target areas in some cases, but of course that is a way of suppressing the opposition's power. Calls for mandatory IDs and biometric identity systems. The US Republicans pushing for boots on the grounds. Cameron using Paris to push for Syria war vote. So Patrick Henningsen really very, very accurate with that lot. However, where does it go from there? Well, of course, the same David Cameron is almost boasting about an extra 1.9 billion for GCHQ and further state spying on the public, not only in Britain but worldwide. Coupled with that, we've got calls for more armed police. That's being pushed very, very strongly by head of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe. We've now got the unveiling of UK's paramilitary police, and the Daily Mail's been carrying some particularly unpleasant photographs of this new brand of British policing. Remember, the police in Britain are civilian police. Their job is to work with our consent. Oh no, not anymore. As a result of David Cameron's Conservative government, we are now introducing paramilitary police in UK. Immigration policy, well, we've effectively still got open British borders, and there's a reason for that, of course. It's to create public confusion over terrorism versus immigration. And ultimately, where does that lead? That the British public has been told, be vigilant and spy on each other. Well, Alex, I think it's just appropriate to say, what's your initial comments on that? I know you're lined up and ready to go to tell us about what President Hollande has been speaking about. He's been making major changes effectively to the French constitution. But what's your thought on the overall situation that we've run through there?
It's like the plot of a bad novel, isn't it, Brian? It is utterly predictable. I have to say that after an attack of this kind, a president who feels he's got the right to do so should call a state of emergency, which is nothing other than the suspension of liberties and the revocation of people's God-given rights. And of course, you can do that in a civil law jurisdiction where Parliament makes any law it wants and nobody else can check the validity of laws except judges appointed by politicians. That's what we're being pushed towards in Britain. And if we already had civil law and were fully under the EU's jackboot, we would already have seen Cameron doing much the same. But thank God he hasn't got quite that much power yet.
No, but of course the danger is that this European power with its ratchet mechanism is coming in very quickly. So if there's an overall vote in Europe to bring in this type of, I'm going to deliberately say, the jackboot mentality, then it's going to spread to UK. The other thing is, of course, is that European policy has consistently been brought into UK under the radar, not visible to the public, the so-called convergence policies. And we're now starting to see those policies which have been driving our civil service in particular, they are now having effect on the streets because as one example, these paramilitary police have not suddenly popped out of a box somewhere. There was pre-planning to decide that this sort of police structure was necessary. The uniforms and the equipment had to be procured. So this is something that's been considerably pre-planned, I would suggest, well before the Paris attacks. Perhaps I'm being unfair.
I don't think you're being unfair, Brian. I mean, we're going to get on to the matter of the lead-in time required for budgetary allocations and the sudden announcement of however many thousand extra spies and policemen, whether it's Britain or France. These things are not sprung overnight. They are premeditated, and they need many levels of planning, hierarchically, and also levels of iteration in terms of project management. They're not done overnight. I think of Chief Constable Sarah Thornton, your favourite Chief Constable of Thames Valley Police, because she's now got the role of head of the National Council of Police Chiefs. There she was laying a wreath on behalf of the nation's constables at the cenotaph. And of course, all this would have been done and dusted by the time she laid her wreath. And now it's sprung upon us as a completely new decision. So she was actually betraying the legacy of civilian policing and, of course, the police who gave their lives in both wars on the beat by colluding behind closed doors with such planning by people who were never elected.
Good points, Alex, and very interesting that the Daily Mail, in one of its articles, actually talks about these paramilitary police emerging from the shadows. And obviously the mental image you're given there is that there's something dark going on, and these are the creatures in the night which are becoming visible for the public. When I read that, is the Daily Mail actually waking up? We know that some of their reporters, as indeed reporters from other mainstream newspapers, are waking up. But is this also nudging the policy into the public mind? But you've been looking in some detail at what's been happening in France at the moment, and it does appear that there is now a significant clampdown with Holland changing the constitution. I'll just bring this up on screen here. We've got Article 36, which is, I think, the key one that he's changing. But I have also prepared Article 16, which you mentioned just before the programme. What's going on here? What can you tell us about this?
Before I dissect the text on screen, I'll give you the background of this article. Le Monde is, of course, the Times of France. It's the serious newspaper that the government uses to blow its own trumpet and to leak things officially. And my translation of the relevant bit of Le Monde's article covering this story is this. The president has told Congress, one of the French names for Parliament, that he wants a huge revision of the constitution to, quote, this is a quote from his speech now to Parliament, to allow public forces to act against warfare terrorism in accordance with the rule of law, end of Hollande's quote. And he uses the phrase, le terrorisme de guerre, the terrorism of war or warfare terrorism. I think he's just coined that, also one of his advisors at the Élysée has. And then Le Monde adds that according to a government source that has given them an official leak, the plan is for the creation of a constitutional regime called a state of emergency, which doesn't exist at the moment, and that French citizens can get what they call an exit visa, basically a banning order, and French residents as well, citizens of other countries resident in France, perhaps married to a French man or woman, they can be banned from returning if they are implicated in terrorist activities abroad. Sound familiar?
Yes, it does. I believe that Le Monde has also been comparing what's going on to the Patriot Act in the States.
It has. It has taken a leaf out of the United States playbook, and it foresees heavy curtailment of civil liberties if the Constitution is amended. And it says, quote, we can expect curfews, transport lockdowns, prohibition of freedom of association, closure of institutions, these could include places of worship, press censorship, and house arrests by ministerial decree. And if we go back to that constitutional slide, I'll take you through that. The current text of Article 36 is as follows. L'état de siège est décrété en Conseil de ministres. So a siege state, a state of siege, will be decreed by a council of ministers. The new text, the new wording is in bold, is l'état de siège et l'état d'urgence. So those two things can be called by a council of ministers. The new one is a state of emergency, a constitutional nonsense that the French never used to have. The second clause of the current article in the Constitution is that it can be prorogued after a certain length of time, but this needs to be approved by Parliament. The new text, just the second article, just pluralizes the first one because we have two problems now, the state of siege and the state of emergency. But the third text is new. It talks about a so-called organic law, that's French legal speak for a statutory instrument, will define these regimes and specify their conditions of application, the conditions in which they can be applied. So in other words, the Constitution is going to give carte blanche, a nice French term there, to allow a council of ministers to write its own statute law to declare a state of emergency. In other words, it's a constitutional cover for tyranny.
To which I pause because you've said that. Where do we go from here? Tyranny unfolding in France on the back of the Paris attacks. And as we're going to hear in a little while's time, basically there's increasing evidence that, of course, these attacks were known about. And then we can, against that background, we can start to question how these attacks have arisen. Mike, you're keen to come in on that previous point by Alex.
Yeah, Alex, I've just got a question. Would it be unfair to say that this is an enabling act?
I don't think that's unfair at all. French politicians always talk, good statists as they are, about the law must be amended to allow certain things. I mean, you yourself, Mike, spend some time in France and you hear people complain to each other. If they don't like what someone else is doing, they often say, vous n'avez pas la loi. You don't have the law to do that. That's the French constitutional mentality, unconstitutional mentality, that if there is a law, anything is possible. In other words, things become lawful and constitutional by being on paper, not by being God-given or established by precedent or by philosophy.
So very dangerous changes unfolding in France. Something else that you've pointed out for us is that Holland has announced a freeze on shrinkage in the armed forces, the creation of 5,000 extra police and gendarmes, rising to 10,000 within 5 years. Isn't it remarkable that we have David Cameron consistently cutting British armed forces, whilst, of course, he drives the British armed forces to closer cooperation with the French. Something happens in France, instantly there's going to be protection of police levels and the armed force levels. UK, massive cuts in the police, which have been consistently pushed, while David Cameron has been standing on the world stage and warning of the dangers of international terrorism. Have we got two personalities working in David Cameron at the moment? Does he actually understand what comes out of his mouth? Or is there something a bit more sinister going on in Tory policy?
I often think that he may have a split personality. Not that I'm much of a psychiatrist, but it does seem obvious even to the layman that there's Dave the despot and Dave the something else beginning with D. And the two of them seem often to be a kind of Jekyll and Hyde combination. I think sometimes Cameron envies the French for their ability just to click their fingers and make things happen, whether it's planning law or something as serious as how many paramilitaries you can have on the streets. And we just mentioned in passing Article 36. The point about that is that it goes further into the definition of a state of siege. And if you put that, you're going to put that up on screen there, it's going to be reworded to allow civilian policing powers to be transferred to the army and to impose what the new text of the Constitution, if voted through, will call juridiction militaire, martial law to us. And once this has been established by a president in France as a leading EU member state, no doubt Cameron, having slashed everything to the bone, will say, well, this is what we need. And of course, we need to staff such a new paramilitary force with the continental policemen at a loose end who are already trained and raring to go because we don't have any of our own.
Alex, this is quite staggering because at the European Defence Agency conference, we covered this on the news yesterday, this was exactly one of the major themes of that conference, was the merging of civilian and military institutions. And you've got to say that if that was a feature of that conference, and this is a response to, I mean, that was a feature of that conference which was not a response because that conference was already planned before the Paris attacks happened. But this is a response to Friday the 13th. Then how come there's this similarity in the policy here? This is clearly something that was being thought about for a significant period of time before what happened on Friday. So they've simply used this as an excuse to impose previously held policy?
This is exactly the case. And I think the key in what you just said there, Mike, was it must have been planned a significant period of time ago. I would argue that it was planned back in the 1970s. Patrick was the expert about Operation Gladio and the relaunching of it. And that's the 1970s plan to stoke domestic terrorism across the continent, starting with Bologna in Italy in 1980 with a horrific railway station bomb that people don't really remember these days. That is probably where the planning started, because it was back in the 80s and even the 90s that young people who are now serious politicians across Europe were communists. And they were in these cells, some of which were operating with NATO collusion and really being operated at arm's length by NATO. I'm not suggesting that Mogherini herself was involved, but she was in that ideological bracket. You mentioned yesterday that Federica Mogherini, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, the sort of puppet of a foreign minister that the European Union has, she was the one calling for the blending of civilian and military, and she first joined the Communist Party of Italy. She claims that's all behind her now, but she's rather close to foreign powers even so.
As an ex-serviceman, I do find this remarkable, Alex, to have watched people that back in the Cold War days, we were looking at certain individuals, we looked at their extreme politics, we looked at the fact they were talking subversion, they were talking about how to overthrow democracies in the West, and then these very same people you could watch rise to positions of power within the European Union. And of course, we've only got to take the judicial system in Europe to see that many very, very dubious people who were assisting some pretty vicious regimes in Eastern Europe were then suddenly dusted off, given new clothes and told that these were the people who were going to safeguard democracy and freedom within the European Union. While all this was going on, apparently, our intelligence services seemed unable to actually work out what was going on, were unable to warn us. A little bit later, we're going to have a look at this theme again, that did Britain's security services know about the French attack? Something has gone on with the mentality of people, Alex. A system which was originally there to defend us suddenly seems incapable of watching what's going on in a worldwide political sense.
I think that Britain, as a military and intelligence conglomerate, really stopped doing the watching on behalf of its citizens a long time ago. Perhaps the early 90s is about the best period we can date it to. A decision seems to have been taken, well, was taken as far as I'm concerned, in the early 90s overnight, and you've spoken about this from the Royal Navy perspective. It's before my time in GCHQ, but I know about it from open source material. A decision was taken at that time overnight to write off certain Eastern European countries as future members of the EC, as it then was, the EU, as it became after 92, and that there was no longer any possible threat coming from them and that we should stop looking, certainly not regard their political systems and personalities as a threat anymore. And that is where the threat has now come from. So they've come out of left field, but it was only left field because we blinded ourselves to that side.
Of course, one of the really good books on this is Christopher Story's EU Collective Enemy of Its Member States. If people are interested in what we're talking about, people were warning, Christopher Story in particular, some excellent political analysis on the monster building in Europe. And of course, he included tables showing what the plan was to subvert democracy in the West. I think we'll bring those to the fore in the coming news reports. But let's go back to the French. They're crowing, apparently, Alex, because, well, they've got their aircraft carrier at work, and they're going to forge an alliance against Daesh. And
well,
I've never been too sure of that word. What can you tell us about?
Daesh is the Arab acronym for the Islamic State in Ash-Shams, which is one of the Arabic names for the Levant, the whole area of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq. The French have always used that acronym, and it's suspected that they don't like using the phrase État islamique, the French translation of Islamic State, because they're very insistent that they are not fighting a state and that they're not at war with Islam. Now, in a sense, that's quite a sensible position to take, but it also shows that they're in a double bind because they can't identify their enemy. This total secularization, laicism, as it's called in France, forbids any mention of the enemy having any ideology, whether it's a particular interpretation of the Quran or whatever it may be. So they're really at a loose end to describe what they're fighting against. But this article, Hollande, Putin and Obama, it describes them as being in league against the Islamic State. But again, like the Les Echos article I highlighted last week on French bank accounts, it's content free. It describes that the Russians, Putin has directed his Russian Navy to collaborate with the staff of the Charles de Gaulle about launching joint airstrikes. I don't know where the Charles de Gaulle is at the moment, whether it's in the Mediterranean or on patrol somewhere else.
It's usually somewhere for repairs, I think, Alex.
Yes, it's spent more time put into Brest than it has at sea of late, hasn't it? So I don't know whether that's from the decks of the Charles de Gaulle or I think that's a mirage in that picture, isn't it? So it probably will be. But the point is that the initiative is coming from the Russians, and Patrick describes very fluently on Monday why that is. It's because Putin has a master plan, as far as I can see, to force the French, who are no less culpable than the Anglo-Saxons here, to come clean about the fact that they have really no intention of fighting this, whatever it is, chimera called Islamic State, because their money went into it in the first place.
Well, I've got to say that I'm going to smile slightly because, of course, this is black humour, but it is becoming most confusing that David Cameron has told us absolutely that an Islamic State exists. We're fighting it. We're counter-terrorism operations against it. Now you're telling us that the French say, well, it clearly doesn't exist. So we've got a little bit of disagreement there. And then we've got this conundrum of, well, you know, are they good terrorists or bad terrorists? This is not a joke. This is a complete scam which has been created by the higher political systems in UK and Europe. This situation, as we are being told in the mainstream press, cannot be real. How do we justify the fact that we are effectively at war against an Islamic State and the French are saying, well, it doesn't exist?
Funny you should mention that, Brian, because it's Hollande who said we are at war. But then, in order to be at war, one or other side has to declare war, doesn't it? And as far as I'm concerned, with the Geneva Convention and all those other fuddy-duddy documents going straight back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, there has to be a contract or a treaty signed by two state parties to begin and to end a war.
Of course, the other advantage about using war, we have been attacked and we are at war, is it helps lever in the participation of NATO. So I would imagine there's a little bit of politicking from that direction here. The attack on one is an attack on all. Well, if we're not managing to counter the Islamic State, Daesh, or IS or ISIL or Al-Qaeda for that matter, with military forces, apparently there are people suggesting some other ways of doing it.
This gentleman on screen is called Jean-François Pilou. That's like Pillock, but with an OU on the end instead of an OCK. And he looks like one, doesn't he? His job title, rather Anglo-Saxon one, I would say, for a self-respecting French journalist, is Head of Digital Development. That's his the French version of his title translates as that. And he's the head of digital development at La Figaro, which is a kind of popular version of Le Monde. So it's mid-market. And he's written a much shared Facebook post, of which you put a screenshot there on screen. Here's my translation of it. So I'm launching, he writes in his Facebook post, this digital journalist, I'm launching the idea of putting together an incubator or some funds intended to maintain startup companies that are ready to Uberize the struggle against terrorism. That's a reference to Uber, the taxi app, which has got the Parisian cabbies up in arms. And he writes, I'm doing this in the hope that this message in a bottle, so he's pretending that he has no power and that he's just having to float his ideas out there. I'm hoping that this message in the bottle will be read by someone in the government, because this kind of initiative can only be managed or directed, porté, carried by government bodies.
So if I've got that right, we're going to bring in the private sector directly in the fight against terrorism.
I can't see any other way of interpreting that, because by definition, a startup, even if it's got fistfuls of confiscated money, as David Scott would call it, taxpayers' money, it is by definition a private industry. And what do you get when you pursue the state's war-making aims through favoured private companies, even if you call them a hip startup on the Rive Gauche in Paris? What you've got is public-private partnership, otherwise known as fascism.
Okay, fascinating. And I believe you noticed at the same time that Thales, the huge French defence firm, shares are up. They're doing well at the moment.
Yes, the Parisian Stock Exchange, the notably named CAC, C-A-C, has plummeted, as you can imagine, in this last week. One notable exception is Thales, which seem to supply all our parts for trains and warships and everything as well these days. They were up 3 or 4% just in the last 5 days. So that is, since the very day of the attack, they have gone up. So investors in the French war-making machine know a thing or two.
Presumably the orders are coming in for the military equipment and the munitions already. And interesting to note that life's looking good for the French defence industry. But of course, we know that British aerospace seems to be being undermined with rumours in Whitehall that the plan is essentially to collapse it, to allow it to be broken up. That means that UK will have no defence capability within the nation state at all, but maybe that's for another time. So what's happening on the streets then in Holland and elsewhere? You've got the Telegraph here talking about Molenbeek now being the jihadi capital of Europe.
Well, Molenbeek Saint-Jean, or in the Dutch version, Sint-Jans-Molenbeek, is a poor district in Brussels. And here is a Dutch low market newspaper, De Telegraaf. It's something like the Daily Mail or lower equivalent. In its foreign news section is crowing, just like the French are crowing, because they're both neighbours of the Belgians and both look down on them, that Molenbeek, this little, if you like, Tower Hamlets equivalent in Brussels, is the jihad capital of Europe. Now, I must admit, on my travels through Brussels, which are quite frequent, I don't go looking specifically for the bad areas. But I have to say that Molenbeek has got at least as many East Europeans and Mediterraneans in its poor quality housing as it has Arabs. It's portrayed in the French and Dutch media as the root of all evil, as a nest of nasty Moroccans who keep goats on balconies and all kinds of stuff. It's just whipping up hatred, isn't it? But if you're a journalist, you can get away with it. If you're a private citizen, you'll get arrested for instigating hate. But if you're a journalist, you can get away with it.
Alex, I'll just bring up the comment on screen, if my and so begins the demonisation of Arab immigrants in the press. This joins in with that little comment I made earlier, saying that it's remarkable that in UK we've got effectively an open door immigration policy. So the government says, no, we've got to keep the doors open. And then with the other hand, the government is saying, well, we've got to be fearful of everybody coming in. And you're picking this up as well, I think, in this article, that the finger is now being pointed at a great group of people. They all must be guilty. They all must be terrorists. Therefore, everybody's got to be fearful. This is deliberate, surely.
It is deliberate, Brian, and it's for a very simple reason. Tyrants down the ages have known that in order to try to forge a single people out of many people groups who don't wish to be governed together, you need a common enemy. In first century Rome, it was the Jews and Christians, and nowadays it seems to be the Muslims. And I've got an interesting example of that. I travel on the international trains quite a lot, including the Amsterdam to Paris Thalys high-speed train that had that rather dodgy incident happen on it recently. I only usually take the Rotterdam to Antwerp section, and I noticed that the station flags, both on the Dutch and the Belgian side of the border, were at half-mast on Monday for what was described as a pan-European day of mourning against these for these attacks and to protest against these awful Arabs that did them, is the official story. I noticed, however, that when we pulled into Belgium at 12 o'clock, there was a station announcement. We were stopped at the station at the time, that we were going to have the 1 minute silence for the victims. And there was a kind of mutter that went through the carriage, and all these ordinary Flemish commuters were saying, as far as I could make out, "Oh, bloody French, nothing to do with us." Now, if the Belgians and French don't, at a visceral level, feel that they're part of one project called Europe, or that one attack on one is an attack on us all, then there isn't much hope for the periphery of Europe ever to feel one, is there?
No. You've got some interesting photographs of life on the streets in Belgium here.
Yes, note this is to protect the Jodenbuurt in Antwerp, which I travel through a lot. And Antwerp, as you probably know, is the centre of the diamond industry, and there's a very large Jewish population concentrated there beside that rather grand central station that you can see on both pictures with the red brick bridge there. Now, you can see the Hasidic Jews ostensibly being protected. And this goes back to January this year, when there was another attack by this same ostensible terrorist group from Molenbeek against the Jews of Antwerp. But you're a Navy man, but I'd like your comment on this. Whenever you see French soldiers on the street, and under the Franco-Belgian model, they can be called out whenever the president wants. For example, if you're passing through a railway station in France, they have a kind of reassuring calm about them, and the warrant officer is usually the only one with a rifle. The others just have sidearms. Here, the standard model is to send them out in paratrooper berets, and with this aggressive posture of the rifle slung diagonally across the chest to maximize the aggression impact. And that's just how they patrol, or used to patrol, in the Belgian Congo, isn't it? And look at it's not really for a rapid response, because the right hand is actually on the barrel and the left on the butt. So you couldn't fire quickly from that position. It's not there for, like the British Army used to do, to have a ready firing position. It's simply there to swagger and to maximize the visual effect.
Well, I would agree with that. And of course, we can come down to, so if they put 200,000 troops on the streets, what is that actually going to do? Does it reduce the risk of another attack? Personally, I don't think it does. But perhaps we should say at least those soldiers are showing their faces, and the fact they've got berets on is generally accepted as a slightly more relaxed, low-key approach than being fully kitted up with helmets. A little bit later, we're going to have a look at some of these new paramilitary British police. And of course, one of the key factors is that you've got full face masks. So you are faced as an unarmed civilian with paramilitary police, or perhaps they're troops, who's to know, but you can't even see the faces of these people. This is serious stuff unfolding. Unfolding very, very quickly, just days after the Paris attacks. But a few people are commenting in our chat room, it's getting easier and easier to put pieces of the jigsaw together. Let's come over to the Chancellor, who we mentioned. Additional, well, actually, Cameron's commenting here, but George Osborne's also been saying that we've got to ramp up GCHQ. Additional 2,000 spies will be hired at MI5, MI6, GCHQ to fight those who would destroy us and our values. So David Cameron waxing lyrical again, money no object. What do you make of this one?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, the first trailing, at least by the Daily Telegraph, of the 2,000 spies figure was on Monday morning, Can you roughly confirm that was about the case?
That was the case, yes.
Yes. In other words, Her Majesty's government had a weekend to think up a budgetary allocation of 2,000 extra hires. Do you believe that, Brian?
No, but I've got to laugh and say I don't believe a single thing we're being told about the Paris attacks or what subsequently emerged from it.
Well, we've got these two data sets to tie up, haven't we? We've got the 2,000 extra spies announced on Monday. Clearly, as Mike said yesterday, or I think Patrick on Monday, it's a rehashing of old news. Besides that, we have George Osborne's figure at the Treasury of just shy of £2,000 million, right? So 2,000 spies, £2,000 million. But the mental arithmetic doesn't stack up. Most of these, the overwhelming majority of these new hires, are going to be what used to be called EO grade, executive officer, otherwise known as a 10. And allowing for last few years inflation and wage increases, and if you add the half again on top of the salary for national insurance and pension costs, the cost of each EO to the government is in the order of 50,000 a year. That's not going to be far out. We're just talking mental arithmetic here. And if you multiply that by 2,000, you end up at £100 million. That's 1/20th. That's 5% of this extra £2 billion. The other 95% is presumably going to go on equipment.
So we might deduce that the government under David Cameron is not telling us the truth, possibly.
Well, certainly not, because any government department wanting an allocation from the Treasury holds the whip hand over other departments because it holds the purse strings, has to go cap in hand every year saying, these are our successes, these are the key performance indicators we've met, the targets. We need to do more of this jolly good work. And that needs to be arranged in the previous financial year. And sometimes the planning is 3 to 5 years ahead for big projects with big lead-in times, people or equipment or buildings. And yet you covered the Gloucestershire Echo last month, reporting that GCHQ already wants to tarmac over its car park. So even before the Paris attacks, there was a suggestion that there were going to be, I forget how many 100 extra hires over the next few years. This has been going on for months, if not a year or two. There's no other way for it, unless Dave the Despot finally has taken over from his alter ego and has just clicked his fingers and told Osborne and the Treasury to allocate an eye-watering sum. But I don't believe that the civil servants would accept that.
No, I don't either. Let's go back to a report that we've shown before. So this is of a couple of months ago, with the Mail reporting GCHQ spooks spied on there's the word in capitals, every internet user in an operation called Karma Police. A report produced for high-ranking intelligence chief, published by the website, shows spies building up profiles of web users, making links between the radio stations they listen to, their news sources, etc. The stated aim is to map every user visible to passive signals intelligent with every website they visit. And then the work of GCHQ carried out in accordance with strict legal and policy frameworks which ensure activities are authorised, necessary, proportionate. And of course it then says all our operational processes rigorously support this position. In addition, the UK's interception regime is entirely compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. Well, I say with a smile, of course, we are now beginning to see where the European Convention on Human Rights is about to go, and that's the waste bin. So we just thought it's remarkable that GCHQ, taking all the millions of public money it already does, has been boasting that it's been spying on everybody. And if it's doing that, then surely GCHQ would have been the early warning system for the fact there were going to be attacks in France, attacks in Paris. Well, let's have a little look at what GCHQ seemed unable to pick up. And this is the key thing. The government's now saying they need more money, more data access to counter terrorism. We're going to say this is a complete lie, and this is why. GCHQ spying on the world, but nobody knew the attacks were coming. Well, of course they did, because we now know from Associated Press that senior Iraqi intelligence officials warned members of the US-led coalition fighting the Islamic State group of imminent assaults by the militant organisation just one day before last week's deadly attacks in Paris killed 129 people. Well, let's try another one. Turkey was also involved. Turkey shared information on a terrorist group with France, but didn't hear anything back until after Friday's events. The Times of Israel, for months, security officials in France's Jewish community have been warned of the very real possibility of an impending large terrorist attack in the country. And we've also had our own report covering Fox News interviewing the Daily Mail, and they were gaily saying back in September that they were being warned in Turkey of attacks coming. So all of this information drifting into GCHQ, they haven't even got to put a spy out there, they've simply got to get a desk officer to have a look at the internet, and they were being told that an attack was coming, but we haven't heard. I think the expression is a dicky bird out of GCHQ warning of these attacks. And my answer to that is no, because the agenda was to let these attacks happen in order to bring in the clampdown we're now seeing in Europe. Am I getting too cynical in my old age, Alex, on this one? GCHQ, what have they been doing?
Well, I won't go near operational considerations, but you know what their remit is in statute law, and that is the passive collection of signals intelligence. That was the passive SIGINT that was mentioned in that Daily Mail article. Now, as a kind of post hoc correction to things that have already happened, Theresa May announced that GCHQ is going to be given a statutory footing for more active approaches, hacking into computers. So that was done illegally. Some would also say unlawfully, but it has been done for years. But I think I have to answer that by going back to what you said at the start of this segment about the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, if you can't square the duty of GCHQ that you want with the constitution that Britain has, then you have to invent a new statutory framework. So that's why there was such a to-do made about the European Convention on Human Rights and being compliant with that. If you then yank that away, then you're left with no legality for anything, are you? And then, of course, you hope, if you're controlling such things, that people won't realise that what the agencies were being told to do was never constitutional in the first place.
Yeah. Where does it go? Well, I picked up on this report, Times of Israel here, is saying in France, defence experts see parallels to Israel. And the inference was that this brutality and the bombing, etc., is going to become part of daily life exactly as Israel suffers it. So I've labelled that from Paris to British Gaza, because we're now starting to see the creation of some pretty brutal police. But we also thought it was timely to remind people that, of course, the International Business Times here and other papers were saying that British police were actually going to Israel to be trained in tactics and strategy being used during the Gaza crisis. And what have we now got popping out of the shadows, to quote the Daily Mail? Well, they're not in black, they're in low visibility grey, apparently. But this is the launch of Britain's paramilitary police. I don't think it can be a coincidence that this has come out of the shadows after the Paris attacks. And it seems remarkable that we've had senior British military officers going to Israel. We've got Matthew Gold, the former British ambassador to Israel, who's now been brought into the cabinet office. We're apparently learning from Israeli tactics in Gaza. What we want to learn from that, I'm not sure. And now we've got emergence of robo-cops. Something is at work in the background here, Alex.
Yes, Brian, I'm looking at that slide you just put on there, and I'm wondering a couple of things about how this is going to use the Home Office phrase, how this is going to be policing by consent in line with the British people's values. Let's not forget here that Her Majesty's coronation oath was to govern us according to our laws and customs. Our wise forefathers wrote that into the coronation oath in the 1690s, so that there was no possible way of getting round that obligation. You can't do anything to the British people constitutionally that they haven't accepted by historical precedent. You can't spring surprises on them and call it constitutional. Now, if we look at that uniform there, perhaps you can put it back on screen.
Oh, sorry, just a second.
All right. Even if you can't, don't worry. It's coming, I think. Yes.
There we are.
Now, this chappie has got an earpiece on, I presume, under his helmet. Yeah,
well,
so
I'm going to say the first thing is I'm pretty sure that this isn't a he at all. I think this is a girl, because if you look at the photo closely, I think you're looking at eyeliner. Of course, who knows these days, because it's getting a bit difficult to tell the difference between the girls and the boys. But I think this is actually a girl.
So it's in three senses not a policeman. It's a woman. There's no constitutional policing going on, and most importantly, we don't even know the nationality of this person. They can be receiving instructions in any language through an earpiece. They don't have to speak English to do this kind of policing. They don't have to think. They don't have to know our constitution. Try going up to one of those constables and saying, well, they would hate to be called a constable, even if they could hear you. Try going up to one of them and saying, "Constable, what is your name and number?" What would happen then?
Probably tasered, I would think, but we'll leave that for another thing. But I take the point. We are getting into a very, very dangerous stage in Britain. And of course, it's Britain's police men and women who have got to stand up and fight what is actually happening, because these people will be used on any segment of society. It doesn't matter whether you're a professional, doesn't matter whether you are police, ex-military or whatever. Let's have a look at something we've reported before, which is David Cameron. Remember that David Cameron boasted that his loyalty was to Israel. This was well publicised. My belief in Israel is unshakable. So David Cameron, British Prime Minister, happy to say it isn't Britain that his loyalty is. His loyalty is unshakable with Israel. But of course, this is the man with immense power over all of the intelligence services that are now being ramped up in light of events in Paris. And we've shown this before. We've also shown this, of course, the Cabinet Office building up this phenomenal relationship with Israel. Here's the training of the police again. Then we've got Russia Today reporting on collaboration. Here's the academics going to share expertise over cyber security threats. And these were some of the universities and organisations involved with UK and Israel. We've got elements of the Israeli security services as well. Let's bring them in. Here we are, Israeli Defence Force Unit 8200 working with GCHQ, a group of digital companies we brought in Common Purpose because, of course, they've been working with the Cabinet Office to reframe people. And we've got an UK-Israel Memorandum of Understanding on Digital Government. So very, very close ties with Israel. Nobody's voted for this. How has this come about, Alex? Can you give us any insight into why aren't we teaming up with the Germans or Italy? Why is it Israel that comes into the picture here?
I suspect if you keep it on a political level, it's because Israel is respected by a certain kind of politician for its bloody-minded determination to survive against hostile odds. And possibly it's attractive to a certain kind of dangerous politician in the West because it's a nation that is transparently at war with internal and external enemies and effectively at war with a large section of its own population. And even in international law terms is occupying some of its population. Whether or not you accept the legality of that or the biblical background is neither here nor there. If we talk about political realities, that is the kind of state Israel is. So obviously it has lessons in keeping people subdued and managed that the Germans and Italians don't need because they have, well, certainly the Germans, an obedient population that wouldn't say boo to a mouse and doesn't need anything more than a chap with a green Polizei cap before giving up the game, you know?
Well, there's another element, of course, and we just jumped back to a report Mike did a couple of days ago, and this is the fact that we've now got Britain's security services top officials casually mixing with the private sector. And I just thought we'd bring this in again, your mention of these starter companies, that the gentleman in France is saying we should get the private sector involved in anti-terrorism. I think this is already going on, and this is what this top-level meeting was about where we've got MI5, MI6, GCHQ mixing with Shell and bankers. This shouldn't be allowed because, of course, at the simplest terms, national security is at stake. What is actually taking place in a room with closed doors where there's discussions with Shell, for example?
Well, speaking from a Cheltenham perspective, GCHQ directors tend to be good in post, although somewhat wowed by the bright lights of London. And after they retire, they get their knighthoods, usually during their tenure these days, but certainly afterwards. And then they go off and make a pile of cash, and something happens to them. I have to say I'm frankly disappointed that Sir Ian Lobban, who was the last director during my time at GCHQ, has done this. I mean, he was known as Lobbo internally. He was a very friendly character. And I didn't have much to do with him personally, but he was a friendly face around the office and certainly a man of the people kind of chap. And for him to be going off to Glen Eagles talking to big business like this behind our backs is really not his role at all. But a certain arrogance has always been there in that rank of the civil service. The first director I served under was Sir Francis Richards, who went off to be governor of Gibraltar. Now, he announced that the donut was going to be built and then did a bunk before we actually got there and discovered that the parking spaces were too few for all of us. And we had great nightmares. But that was foreseeable even in his day. And he promised us all that it would be his directors who would be responsible for finding a parking space and not the individual GCHQ officer. A promise broken. He was a very arrogant man. There were people who were unable to be in the same room as him because of his arrogance. Lobban I'd expected different things of, but I think it just goes to show that these guys' heads are turned during their tenure. And they have people talking to them who are not part of the legitimate chain of command. They're not coming through the Joint Intelligence Committee or the Cabinet Office, at least not through their proper ranks of it. And that these figures are telling the directors of our intelligence agencies, well, you're a public figure now, you're a national asset, and it's your job to go and sell UK PLC, a phrase you often hear on the inside. You've got to sell that to big business.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being frank about the intelligence service side of it. I'll just give my piece on the military at the moment. This is interesting. Russia today has got a photograph of the Royal Air Force. That is the plane, apparently. They were picking up on the fact that Cameron is still wobbly over trying to get a vote through Parliament. And of course, Corbyn at the moment is saying that he's still not going to back military action. So we'll see where that goes. But what we wanted to flag up here is that we're being consistently told now that Britain's senior military officers are, quote, like rabbits in the headlights. They simply do not know what's happening around them. They don't understand the Conservatives' change programme. They don't understand why they've been sidelined. They don't understand the government's response on terrorism. And the key bit is these people are apparently just too frightened to actually speak out. They've been warned off by relatively low-grade civil servants. So we've got Britain's top military officers now rabbits in the headlights, too scared to move, while we watch this very sinister policy evolve. And of course, we're seeing a treasonous cutting in Britain's armed forces. I think I'll leave it on that one. We are going to say, and it's interesting to note people talking that, of course, everybody's looking for who's the cause of this trouble. UK Column's policy is that we are not going to label one national group or one religious group. This is clearly untrue. We're looking for something much deeper than that. You were keen to put in a little biblical quote here, Alex. Over to you.
Yes, in the Hebrew it's Shomer Ruach lo Yizrak, wa ro'eh ba'avim lo yiktzor. He that observes the wind shall not sow, and he that regards the clouds shall not reap. In other words, this is a verse that's encouraged me greatly recently. You can always think that it's not an opportune moment to speak out. I've had enough doubts, although I'm straying nowhere near classified information, about whether I should be frank about GCHQ. And to be honest, part of that is because people in our own movements can't really believe that anyone with the right intentions would ever go to such an institution. But believe me, they're good-hearted people in GCHQ and across the intelligence services and beyond. There's always a good moment to speak. But never be put off by the thought that it's such a dark day. Those are the clouds and the winds talked about in the verse. Never think that it's such a dark day that you can't do any good, that this isn't the time to speak, that people are too busy watching EastEnders instead. Speak, scatter the seed, and trust in the Lord to do the rest.
Brilliant. Alex, thank you very much for joining us today. I think that's been a very interesting look at what is starting to unfold in Europe. It's beholden on all of us to do something about it. You've given us the push there to speak out, tell the truth. And of course, we've got to recruit people who are in the very institutions being used to do these dark deeds. Is it true that all policemen and women are bad? Of course not. What we've got to do is engage with the people who at the moment may be feeling very isolated and unable to speak out. So if you're looking at problems in UK, and as we've said before, people coming into the country are joining a life raft. It's up to all of us to get on to make sure the life raft of the United Kingdom doesn't sink. If we end up fighting amongst ourselves, that of course is what the hidden hand requires. Thanks very much for joining us. That's the end of our news today. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.